Hi, everyone. I'm Brooke Boulton. I teach freshman writing at Winona State University in southeastern Minnesota in the United States. And I'll just give you a forewarning. My cat is currently asleep on my lap. So if he becomes problematic, just bear with me as I shift rooms. I want to provide you with a little bit of context for my background. I am new to EAP. I'm new to ESL. So what I'll be talking with you about today is actually based on my doctoral research, which I finished not that many months ago. So this is actually the first time that I'll be talking about my research and joining this conversation. So I'm really interested in any input that the audience might have or any questions that you might have at the end. So I came about my interest in English for academic purposes, and more so how multilingual students develop identities in English while they are writing from the experiences that I've had teaching writing over the years. So in the United States, we have community colleges, which are two-year institutions designed to either prepare students for four-year study or they're technical programs that help prepare students for jobs. And I was working at a really small community college, actually right on the Canadian border between Minnesota and Canada. And we were recruiting students for athletics. And students were coming from Puerto Rico, Arizona, Southern Florida, Colombia. And we did not have the resources at our institution to help these students with their English. And not having a background in ESL, I did what I could for them, but I've been joining presentations today talking about the use of the translation tools online, and this is often what students were using. So that's sort of where my interest began, is how are these students writing? What are they doing to write? What are some of their practices? How are they developing these identities in English? So that carried over into my doctoral research, but also into the work that I'm doing with doctoral students in education programs here in the United States. So I have an interesting perspective working with freshman college students, to speaking with international students who have completed a dissertation, also to students who are currently in the process of writing their dissertations and who are multidisciplinary. Okay, I didn't mean for that introduction to be so long, but I hope that context is helpful. So I want to ask two questions of those of you who are watching. And this sort of connects back with what Mike and Klaus were talking about earlier. Can we separate English for academic purposes from the identity and culture of language? And is English more than a tool in academic contexts? So in my research, really what I was wanting to see is how students perceive the use of English. What are their attitudes toward using English, and do they see themselves as having to negotiate an identity or a sense of self when writing between their native language and the English that was required for their dissertations? So for the context of my research and for this presentation, we're calling the dissertation the academic purpose here. And so I covered this a little bit just a second ago, but looking at these doctoral students' writing practices, their translation practices, the concept of language filters, which is something that they were doing psychologically, identity negotiation, and the presence of agency, authorial voice, and then of course their attitudes and perspectives toward these processes. Agency was the most complicated concept for me to navigate in my research, because what I found with had about 30 participants all across the globe. Only one student out of those, only one participant out of the group had the option to write in English. So in my dissertation, I was writing about, where do we draw the line between agency and choice when there really is no choice? Students are required to write and participate in global academia using English. We'll come back to some of those conversations here in a second, but thinking about the dissertation as a symbol of academic purpose, why are we using English? What do we want to do with English? But also, what do we want to do with our dissertation? Where are we positioning ourselves within scholarly conversations or within our professions? And what happens is when students' access to English resources is limited, that affects their mobility. So regardless of the selfhood that they have, the goal of their selfhood, regardless of what that is, it might be limited based on their access to English and to English resources, whether that's participating in an Anglophone university, having current research published in English that they can access, or even having the proficiency to read, write, and translate between their native language and English. Another factor that comes into this is the faculty that they're working with. Are the faculty in their programs native English speakers, or are they also English language learners or using English for academic purposes? So all of these factor into students' perceptions of English and the selfhoods that they are able to achieve. So the writing process or the writing practices of the participants that I spoke with mostly mentioned translation, modeling writing that they were reading throughout their literature review process, checking for meaning and expression between the native language and target language being English, and developing multiple voices in the dissertation itself. So some participants commented on different sections of the dissertation require us to use different voices, whether that is objectively reporting on the literature versus interpreting a quotation from someone that they perhaps interviewed, to interpreting or analyzing their findings. So while a voice may be part of the discipline and their identity that they form may be part of a discipline, they still have to navigate multiple voices in their writing, which means that sometimes they're also navigating multiple identities and having to negotiate those identities. So I like to think about English and language from the perspective of culture. And I think that this is where those difficult questions about ownership come up. So I've been reading a lot about English as a global language, as the language of communication within, but also outside of academia. And for me, language and culture really can't be separated, but there are some beliefs that English is just a tool. It is a language that we use to be able to write and publish research, to participate in these conversations, but it's difficult for me to agree with that perspective. There's also the cultural versus linguistic ownership of English. So, can we use English without having that cultural background, or taking on some kind of a cultural identity with that language? And usually when I think about identity, I think about tradition, culture, and language all working together to form that sense of self. And this actually comes from Lauri Honko in his Finnish scholar, who would write about the relationship between identity and epic poetry. So that's sort of where that foundation comes for me. So as I was reading and as I was researching, I thought, I really can't see this distinction between language and culture. And I don't see English as a language that's functioning separate from identity. And it seems difficult for me that we can ask students or users of English for academic purposes to say, you're only using English for this purpose. You're only using English to write this dissertation. so that you can join this global academic community. But upon joining that global academic community, you are then required to use English in different ways. You are speaking, you're joining conferences such as this one. And not only, do you need to be able to write in English, but you need to be able to listen and to understand and participate in the broader conversation. So just a couple of comments about agency, some of the research that I cited in my dissertation. I decided to land on understanding agency as the ability to act. So within a situation, I have the control over the decisions that I am making. So for these doctoral students, the participants in my study, they were able to exercise agency by defining a voice in their writing and being able to achieve that. They did not have the choice to write in English, so they could not exercise agency in that way. But within that lack of choice, they could make their own decisions about who they wanted to become with English and how they were going to write in English. So I feel like even though there are some big issues with English globally, such as it is the language of production, and as Bomick says, these students are operating in highly inequitable social contexts, there are still some choices that can be made in the writing process. And I think that's really what I wanted to celebrate for students who take on this great challenge of having to write a dissertation in a non-native language. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what I learned about the processes that multilingual writers go through. And this might be familiar to some of you. As a very new area of research and interest, for me, this was all very enlightening. So what I found is that students go through a process of thinking, translating, filtering, and writing. And I'd like to share a couple of the theories that I developed from my research. One was related to identity, whereas how the self connects with language, but also connects with the self that's created through the discourse. So the arrows there representing the very fluid nature of identity. But more so related to the process of language and what I called meaningful productive performance is how students move from their native language to the target language of English while they are writing. So part of this comes from theories of languaging and translanguaging and account for cultural translation. So part of the discussion earlier with Mike and Klaus was losing that rhetorical or that cultural component when we're using machine translation. So a thought is generated, it passes through what I call this native language filter. So ultimately what students were hoping to achieve was meaning in English that reflected the meaning in their native language. So they were using translation devices to achieve that meaning, which was a very back and forth process. So thinking and writing in a native language, passing it through that meaning-making language filter, which left them sort of in this gray space of interlanguage, and then ultimately deciding on phrases, sentences, etc., in English that effectively represented what they were hoping to express in their native language. Okay, I think we should be back to the PowerPoint now. Please let me know if that's not the case. All right, so theoretical overview was the theories I just showed. Regarding ownership, thinking back to that process of thinking, translating, filtering, writing, there's also the processes of knowledge production, language proficiency, expression, and possession. And the thinking and the writing processes were ultimately what led to those feelings of ownership and creating those authorial voices. So some of the perspectives from participants, they saw their authorial voice as ownership. Self-expression and meaning making were ensuring that the reader could see their selves in their writing. So participant 4 said, I made sure the reader could somehow see who I am. So for many of the participants that I interviewed and surveyed, making sure that sense of self, that their personality, their expression, and their meaning were clear in the writing and evident to the reader. Others aligned with source materials, modeling writing that they liked in other research articles that they were engaging with. But for most participants, it was the self-expression, the meaning making, the presence of the self in the writing that helped create that sense of authorial voice and ownership in their writing. So I just included a few other clips from the data here. So a sense of creating something that no one else could write, owning the outcome of the research and findings, my own expressive academic writing, and the never feeling that one could not express oneself or could not take ownership of what they wrote. So it was interesting to see how ownership varied from meaning to the ownership of the overall production of the dissertation. And then a few more voices here. I noted participant 9 was a Portuguese speaker, and he said that part of his process was making sure that there was, and he used scare quotes, more Portuguese meaning in his writing, and doing some things like cutting out lots of adverbs and adjectives that might have been more acceptable in Portuguese, but were less acceptable in the academic writing of English. So wanting to retain the meaning of Portuguese, but recognizing that he needed to adjust the language and the style of the writing to meet those academic standards and expectations. And I included this longer quote because to me, this really illustrates the important element of proficiency for these students in negotiating and navigating identity and writing. Dr. Varque was from Argentina, and he said, I think at some point you started thinking in the language you're writing, but it's a long process and it's never complete. So being able to think in English was another point that many of the participants made, and how when looking back at that theory and moving from the target language, moving from the native language to the target language, that the thinking processes are really what most interrupted translating meaning and expression and identity from the native language into English. So looking again at choice versus agency, I noted that really students had no choice but to write in English, but they were able to take ownership of the language once they were in the process of writing. And that is really what they wanted to achieve, was that sense of self and expression between the native and target languages. They're also making the choice to participate in global academic discourse. The issue again there is that the knowledge of English isn't really a choice. You have to have it in order to participate. Agency, being able to develop an identity in English and participate in the discourse and create that discoursal identity. And we've been talking a lot today about the different disciplines and the different writing requirements and voices that emerge across the disciplines. An interesting thing that I did come upon in my reading was that there is a resistance culture developing in a few different countries, namely Finland and France were two that came up, where doctoral students are actually saying, I'm not writing my dissertation in English because I believe that English is really interrupting the means of knowledge production globally, and we should not be producing knowledge in only one language, because it really does affect the cultural opportunities we have from learning in different languages. So ultimately, agency comes back to the doctoral students' desired selfhood. What is their purpose for using English? What do they want to become? There are opportunities for agency there, but still, on the one hand, there are limitations, and on the other, there are opportunities for mobility. And of course, this comes down to where students are from, the opportunities that they have. And, someone commented earlier that a degree from the UK isn't what it used to be. And it was interesting to hear different participants' perspectives on pursuing their doctoral degrees in Anglophone countries, because back in their own country, it really didn't matter, what they were writing or the quality of the writing, just that they had that degree in hand and could return to their home country and say, I've produced this piece of work in English from an Anglophone country, and that will help me to mobilize within my home country. So some final thoughts, who does own this language? There are, of course, debates that English belongs to the native speakers, but there are more non-native speakers of English in the world now than there are native English speakers. So it's difficult to define what ownership means. I definitely see language as part of culture, as part of identity, and I see writing in any form as an act of agency. I think that our tasks, those of us who are here as native English speakers and who are working with multilingual students, is to make sure that we promote our awareness of English and its role globally in academics. And I definitely agree with the conversations that have been happening today that, we need to shift our thinking about standards and expectations of writing, because what I found from my research, which is just one study among many, of course, but is that writers want to express themselves. They want to make meaning. And I think that as professionals who are helping them with their writing, that should certainly be our goal. I hope I'm right on time.
All right, thank you very much, Brooke. That was incredibly interesting to listen to. I'm going to stop the recording now.